What is going on? It's Halsey Schider with the Helicopter Podcast, and this is episode two with Felix Christians. It wasn't supposed to be a two-parter. We kind of got long-winded on his history and talking about Canada and operations in Canada and the flight school that he's associated with. And then we started talking about helicopters and vessels and maritime and boats, and it just got my little brain turning, thinking, man, I kind of want to learn more about that. And that's actually the whole point of this podcast. It's like, I am very fascinated to learn about things in the industry that I'm unfamiliar with. And so I just ask questions that I'm kind of like, hey, this is interesting to me. And I think it resonates. So to our audience, I hope that is the case. We're super excited to have Felix back on for part two. So hopefully, if you haven't listened to part one yet, go back to last week. Check out part one. Felix has a really neat background. He's coming up on 10,000 hours of experience, which I'm told makes you an expert in things. So he's almost an expert, not quite yet, Felix, but you're getting there. And we had a great conversation on part one about the college that he's part of. It's Select Aviation, right, Felix? Did I say that right?
Select Aviation College, yeah.
They have a program he recruits for. He's helping them with the helicopter side. We talked about flying in Canada, learning in the United States, and then going to Canada. We just had a really fun conversation. And then I just felt like, man, we should talk more about boats. So before we get into it, to the Vertical HeliCASTS platform and MHM Publishing, thank you so much for making this whole thing possible. And of course, to our sponsors, we love your support. And to the audience, thank you so much. If you like what we're doing, please continue to listen and like, follow, subscribe. Also go on to Instagram, check out Heli Halsey. I've been doing some fun helicopter adventures recently and excited to share that on social media, and just excited to be here. So Felix, welcome back to part two. Long time no chat.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here.
When I was looking in the mirror this morning, I'm like, I am wearing different clothes, but it's very similar to what I was wearing when we first talked. So I swear I'm not recycling clothes. This is a different jacket and a different shirt, but it's good to see you. Thanks so much for coming back on. Very fascinating stuff. Just to kind of give a quick recap, Felix was hired by a company to consult regarding maritime vessel operations for tour operations. So a giga yacht, so like a large super yacht or a small cruise, essentially was doing guided tours in places like Antarctica, and they thought it would be an awesome idea, which I agree with. Logistical nightmare, but an awesome idea to also throw some helicopters, in this case the H-145, on the deck of this thing, and include that for the guest experience. I think 199 guests on board. They all get to experience the helicopter. And so Felix came in. Supposed to work a couple years on that project, ended up being there for 5 years. And so when we were talking about it yesterday, or on the part one, I should say, it just started to really, my curiosity just for maritime operations. And because of your experience being now 5 years on that project, you ended up starting consulting because you found that there was a need. So let's just peel back the onion a little bit, Felix. And why don't we start with like maritime operations and helicopters? Like, how long has that really been a thing? What are some of the plagues right now? And what are some of the biggest headaches in your world from a consulting point?
Yeah, there's a lot there, that's for sure. And when I started with the project, I had no idea about the regulations really of the maritime world and how aviation is supposed to behave on the maritime world. So I had the wonderful pleasure of reading everything from scratch. And so I found the regulations that were applicable to the industry from the maritime sector and from the aviation sector, and I started reading. And we were also working with a couple of other consultants on the project at the time who had a very strong opinion as to what was required. And because we were sort of in the COVID era, we really had to think outside the box, because there was lots of things you couldn't do anymore during COVID because everyone's sitting at home. And one of the big challenges we were facing was we had to ready a ship that was still ending construction, but we also, because the ship, when it sets sail, it has to have a crew and it has to have a trained crew. And we were facing a problem where training the crew in person was required, and we were just not able to do that, and because we couldn't send anyone anywhere, and then everything was locked down. So we had to get really creative and challenge some of the regulations that we thought were applicable, and we had some success, and we failed in some respects, and the timelines got delayed, but I think that was just the nature of the beast during COVID. But what I did find is that the maritime sector has been catering to the private yacht industry for quite some time. I think the first yacht that had a helicopter on it was some yacht in 1975 or something like that, one of the first yachts to put a private helicopter on a yacht. And they sort of looked to the oil and gas sector for guidance on what was supposed to happen there. And this sort of snowballed into the creation of a regulation called CAP 437. The CAP 437 is a regulation written by the UK Civil Aviation Authority as a guideline. It's not law. And because the UK Civil Aviation Authority doesn't want to have anything to do with owning that regulation, they hand it off to private industry, and they handed it off to people like the HeliCASTS certification agency, who, with a group of others, manage the regulation and update it regularly. And so it is an English regulation, but because the English sort of the pioneers in the maritime world, a lot of people do what they say, and the majority of the world follows what comes out of the UK. And so CAP 437 has really been established as the gold standard in helideck construction, operation, and training requirements for the industry. And it's supported by the Maritime Coast Guard Agency of the UK in as far as the training requirements go. So everything's very English focused, and that's sort of where we landed. But what we discovered in trying to crew this ship is that our vessel lies outside of the regulation, because there's three types of, it gets very complicated, so stop me if it gets too boring, but there's three types of regulations in the yachting industry. And you start with very small yachts, 1 to 12 passengers, very small. And then you go to 12 to 36 passengers. That's under a different regulation, a different code called the Red Ensign Code, a Red Ensign Group, technically. And then past 36 passengers, you're not dealing with yachts anymore. Everything past that is passenger-carrying vessels, and they fall under a regulation called SOLAS under IMO. While the large yacht code for 12 passengers and the Red Ensign Group code for 36 passengers have specific language that addresses helicopter operations on yachts for training, for example, anything outside of 36 passengers doesn't. And that's where we fell. So we have a vessel with 200 passengers, and there was no guidelines associated with what was required. And so we were technically not required to train any of our crew, which was a great sort of enlightenment during COVID, because we're like, we don't have to have training. We can just go.
What's the worst that could happen? It's fine.
Exactly. So, but we obviously didn't do that. So we found a way to send people to training. And the other question was, well, which training is required? And everyone will tell you something different. And the answer is, it's not really, no one's really sure which level of training is required, whether you have to go to an oil and gas training facility like Opito, or there's several others. There's a couple in Italy that we've used, but you can go to the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, but they all train the same thing, basically. They all train you how to put out a helideck fire and other things. The long and short of it is, we fell outside the regulation. We figured out how to train our crews, and we were actually on the forefront of developing our own training protocol for this vessel, because it was unique. Nobody had launched a large vessel to this scale. You know, we were planning on flying 180 guests on average a day, 38 flights going in and out of that vessel. I mean, it's like a floating airport, and yacht operations typically are used to receiving the owner once or twice a week or a month, So the scale of this operation was huge compared to what the industry had been accustomed to. And so what we found was that we very quickly outscaled the existing regulation, both from the maritime sector and from the aviation world. And we're now in a new era of maritime helicopter operations that the regulations are not addressing accurately.
And yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, it seems like this is kind of like a new style of ship. It makes sense, like a private yacht that can take 12 to 36 people, rich people, they have their helicopters and things like that. So, I mean, I guess from that standpoint, it makes sense. This is maybe a dumb question, but I'm full of them. I guess I don't fully understand things like, okay, let's say that I have a yacht in Florida and I'm an American. I got a 145 on the yacht because I'm a baller. Who's really the governing agency controlling, especially like once I'm offshore? Let's say that now I set sail and I'm, halfway to the Bahamas or wherever. Who's the jurisdiction? Because to me, it seems like it's very complicated where it's like, here you are operating a vessel in Antarctica, but it's the UK. I'm just very confused. Enlighten me a little bit on that.
Yeah. So you're right. You're as confused as the regulators. So no shocker there. And the answer is that the onus of whether or not you can land on a heli deck lies with the aviation operator. And the verbiage that is found in some of the aviation regulations is that the operator of the aircraft must find the landing area to be suitable. That's the line, suitable. And so it doesn't specify to which regulation it must be certified, whether it's CAP 437 or the American CFR 46. It doesn't usually specify because it could be that you're flying, internationally and could be flying anywhere. So the deck technically, as far as the aviation operator is concerned, doesn't even have to be a certified commercial deck. It can be a touch and go pad, which most yachts, I would say at least 40-50% of the yachts out there or more have heli decks that are not certifiable heli decks because they're some sleek version of a cleared platform on the front of the boat where, they land occasionally. There's no lights, there's no firefighting equipment, there's no safety equipment, no nothing. And it's just designed for people to land, running, shut down usually, drop your guests off and head back to land. And that's sort of the idea. But so that's from an aviation perspective, it's up to the operator. And the operator has to go and do a risk assessment on the yacht to make sure that, they understand what they're dealing with. Talk to the captain, make sure that the captain understands how to receive the aircraft, how to position the boat, against the wind, whether he's at anchor or dynamic positioning. So all these things have to be discussed prior to any sort of helicopter operation. From a maritime perspective, it's even less clear because the only thing that the maritime industry focuses on is whether the deck is heli-deck certified under CAP 437. Or if it's a touch and go deck. And if it's a touch and go deck, it's free for all. Then there's no requirements whatsoever. And if you're a certified deck, then you have very strict guidelines to follow, like the oil and gas industry. And the same applies for the ships. The interesting thing about it is that while there's regulations for the construction of the deck, the equipment that the deck has to have, and the training that the deck crew must have to operate the deck, there's no training requirements or education for captains and officers who operate the ships. So they go into this blind, in a sense, from an aviation perspective, and they rely heavily on the helicopter operator to teach them on how to operate an aviation asset. The problem with that is the helicopter, usually with private, smaller ship operations, the aircraft's not on board all the time. Neither is the pilot. So they can't talk to each other and they can't really exchange do's and don'ts of the industry. And that's sort of where I come in, is that I will provide you with a more wholesome approach where I combine all the different regulations and all the different practices into one program in order to teach people how to manage an aviation operation at sea. One of the things I've put into place is where I call it an air boss, and the air boss is like a tower controller at an airport, which is it's completely missing from the industry at the moment. You've got your heli deck personnel that manages the deck, but they don't talk to the there's no one on the bridge that oversees the entire operation, vessels coming and going, what's happening in the airspace, what's happening on deck, what's happening with the pilot. And so all that has to come together. And there's just no one to do that currently.
You've obviously worked on these giga ships, and are you also working on these smaller yachts, the 12 to 36?
So I'm trying to get a couple of clients through the door. It's a very tricky industry to break into. But what I started doing after Ultramarine is I started working with a company called Scenic Eclipse. And Scenic Eclipse runs 2 ships. They're also around the 190, 200 passenger vessel. And they also operate 2 helicopters off of the back of the deck. And I've been helping them sort of revamp their operations manual and put in place some of these bespoke learnings that I brought with me to make their operation more efficient, reduce the risk, and therefore the liability for the whole operation.
Yeah. So what is kind of like the day in the life setup? If let's say that I'm not in helicopters, I'm someone that is working on a ship, in this case, this giga yacht, and now they're putting helicopters on it, and I've been selected to be part of that deck team that's helping with the helicopter. What does it look like for that individual? And then what is kind of like the full day? I mean, you're taking, 100 plus passengers on, I think you said 30 plus turns. What does that look like? I'm just curious of how that's managed, who's doing what kind of safety protocols are in there, what happens if the weather changes, how is the helicopter stored, how is it fueled? I'm just kind of curious to hear the whole layout of the operation. It's very fascinating to me.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to unpack there. And this is one of the challenges we had when we first started to figure this out, because we went to the experts and we said, how many people are minimum required to manage a heli deck? And there was lots of different answers there. But it comes down to, you got to have 2 firefighters on the deck that need to be dressed and ready to go for firefighting. So they can't do anything else. They're not allowed to help load the aircraft, nothing. They just got to stand there and look good in their kit. Then you have to have an HLO to manage the deck. That's the helideck landing officer. And you got to have at least 1 helideck assistant. So you need 4 people to run the deck for a helicopter operation. So where do you get these people? Well, it depends how your boat is set up. If you have just crew, then you have to take those people from crew. And because space is always a premium on a boat, and you can't just hire a whole helideck team who does nothing other than helideck operations, these people who fill these roles come from the crew themselves. So it could be like the bosun or the chief officer, or a deckhand or somebody like that. So these are people that are normally occupied with other roles. Then they get put into helideck team roles, right? There's one other thing that I forgot to mention, and is you should have a fast rescue boat in the water ready to assist in a ditching. And that usually requires at least 2 people, 1 driver, 1 person to assist in the rescue. So so now you've got 6 people you technically need to run an operation. And if you have a boat, a small yacht, and there's only, you're only a crew of 11, then some of the other things have to get put on pause while the ship is at anchor and running helicopter operation. Your other option is to hire staff. And staff are, depending on how the boat is set up, are not on the crew list. So staff are like supernumerary people or just listed as guests on the boat. And so they either then take up guest cabin, or you incorporate them as crew as well. But staff can help out, fill those kinds of training roles. And then they can also assist in doing guiding for the guests, so they can do educational programs on board for guests about, the history or geology or something like that. So that's where the crew comes from. So when you ask, what does a typical day look like? Well, it depends on where you take that person from, because they usually have other duties. And then depending on the length of the helideck activity, the person will be on deck for anywhere from like 2 to 4 hours or 5 hours managing helicopter operations. And then they try to rotate them out and get breaks and put other people in place. And when you have long operations like that, you really have to watch duty times, not only for the aviation crew who already have very strict duty times, but the deck crews they've already been on duty in the morning doing their normal job. Then they go to helideck duty. Then they got to rotate them out. So you may not just need 6 people to run a helideck operation. You may need 8 because you're rotating people through, or 12 or whatever, right? So it gets extremely complicated. And the lists we had and spreadsheets on different scenarios, operational scenarios, and going over time and canceling and everything, it just gets extremely complicated. So you really got to do the math and the whole thing to make sure you're on top of it.
Yeah, it seems very complicated. And I want to talk about the complications a little bit, but just to go back, what has been your experience been like training non-aviators, non-aviation people to be around aviation? I think sometimes it's easy for helicopter pilots to forget that helicopters are noisy, helicopters are scary, things are moving really fast. In fact, there's a guy named Eric Thresher. He was on my podcast a long, long time ago, and he said something that I liked. I think it was his theory was called like the Thresher theory or something. And it was this idea that when the helicopter is running and spinning on the ground, a part of your brain, even if you're familiar with helicopters, kind of gets switched off. People do stupid things. You hear the story about the security guard at the hospital that had been, holding traffic for 20 years while the helicopter lands, and then he walks into the tail rotor, even though he's been around the helicopter for that long. So there's like this idea of when the helicopter's running, it's loud, it's noisy, it's scary, that even experienced aviation people can mess up. What has been your experience, with these non-aviation folks and putting them around helicopters, and how much really hours of training does that take, and how much oversight is really required to make sure that they're being safe?
Yeah, good question. I think so. Working with people on boats like this is great because they have the luxury of choice. Everybody sort of wants to work in a field like this. It's exciting. It's new. Helicopters is always, even for especially for non-aviation people, helicopters is like this big wow factor, right? So people want to work there, and so that brings a certain amount of enthusiasm and willpower to the role. So working with deck teams, for example, has been great because they're super interested in learning and adapting to the techniques that you end up developing. Because once they're helideck trained, they now know how to marshal an aircraft, what to expect, refuel, and put out a fire. But they don't necessarily understand the intricacies of rolling the aircraft out of the hangar and putting it together, and some preparing guests for the flight, and being part of a bridge briefing to ensure that all the different things get looked at for the day, all the risks get evaluated, and all the things from the last operation get brought forward to incorporate into this big risk factor matrix and everything. So there's a lot to go and learn there that they normally wouldn't learn, but they've been great to work with so far, and they're really enthusiastic, most of them.
Yeah, I could see it kind of being exciting, and it's the new thing, but also it's a little scary thought, to think about you're taking non-helicopter people and having to make them kind of very important personnel of a helicopter operation. So I could definitely see why training would be so important there. As far as operational control, it's my understanding that the captain is the end all be all when you're on a ship, right? They make all the decisions. They get to ride on the ship. If they hit, if you hit an iceberg, you're supposed to stay in. You're supposed to take it down, right?
Go down with the ship.
Go down with the ship. It's a lot of responsibility. Is there ever conflict between the aviation ops side and, say, the captain or the higher ups, the maritime side of decision making?
I imagine there could be, because this is the big problem, and this is why I built my consultancy, because like I said, no one teaches captains and officers how to manage an aviation operation. So they're going into it blind, and they're relying heavily on the aviation operator to tell them sort of what to do. But as you rightly said, the captain is the master of the vessel, and the entire responsibility lies with that person. So where's the line, right? Because the PIC also has full control of the aircraft. And so the way I teach it is that once the aircraft's rotors are turning, then the pilot in command is responsible for the aircraft, and he will have received takeoff permission or operational permission from the captain prior to. So he's still at that point in control of the aircraft and has full authority to take off, and he has full authority to request a landing, right? And the captain must then also comply and say, green deck for landing, or you can't land right now. We're still busy prepping, or there's another aircraft on deck where it's refueling. You got to hold off. So the captain has authority over happenings on the vessel. Everything in the air is PIC. And so those lines really have to be discussed and agreed upon with all the parties, and they have to really understand where their authority ends, right?
Well, sometimes with authority, there's ego as well. And so has it been complicated at times to navigate that of who is the final decision maker?
Yeah, ego is definitely more a factor with mariners than with aviation, because in aviation we teach ego, right? We teach about the pitfalls of having a big ego and the decision-making process that can be affected there, and how that affects safety. In the maritime sector, I haven't seen that sort of teaching, right? Crew resource management isn't taught really, and that's another thing that I bring into the mix, is that I make the crew understand that they are an extension of the aviation department, and so therefore they are aviation crew as well, and there's certain things that come with that. So yeah, ego, I haven't witnessed it, but I do know that there are some captains out there that are traditional, and they're the final authority, and they're wearing the 4 bars on their shoulder, which we hardly do in our industry anyway.
I make fun of people that wear epaulets.
I remember flying with 4 bars in the Grand Canyon, and
yeah, same.
The guy looking over at me going, "How many hours do you have?"
Yeah. I'm curious to hear, since this was essentially kind of a new program that you guys were developing from the ground up, it sounds like you guys went through different scenarios, and this could happen and that could happen. And going into that first operation, you maybe felt slightly prepared of what could happen and what. But I guess I'm curious now, how many helicopter operations have actually occurred from that specific giga yacht, say in Antarctica? And what are some of the learning lessons from day one operations to how they're currently operating now?
That's a good question. I couldn't tell you the exact number of operations we had, but if you want to do the math on it, we do minimum 2 missions per 10-day, 15-day tour of sort of 38 flights each. So you just do the math on that, and we probably do 10 voyages per season, and we only operate 8 months of the year. The rest is spent traveling from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, and then the boat usually goes into dry dock to get some refit done and some work done. And the aircraft have to come off the ship once a year anyway to go into overhaul. Not overhaul, but like heavy maintenance in the hangar. So I don't know. I can't tell you the exact figures, but lessons learned for sure. And we adjust as we go. We scribble down all our little mistakes and bring them forward, try to learn from them and incorporate it into future procedures. So one of the big things that we came and have refined a lot is a bridge briefing, because all good planning starts with a good briefing. So that's really where the key decisions are made for the entire day. And by key decision, I mean there's a very clear understanding between all the parties involved on the ship as to what constitutes a stop for the day. Wind increase or weather moving in, or there's a problem with passengers. So for example, if we have a passenger have experienced an injury on shore, typically that'll sort of stop the day. Nobody else gets to go because now we're focused just on that, or we don't know how much time it's going to take. So all those kinds of things can happen. But yeah, the bridge briefing for sure is our main lesson learned on how to engage and structure and how a mission should be flown. Another thing I would say, really good lessons that came from all of this, is that there's several manuals involved to follow. This goes back to the regulatory piece. So there's a helideck operations manual the ship's required to have that governs how to operate the helideck, and there's emergency procedures in there. Then the aviation operator usually comes with an operations manual. There's emergency procedures in there, and the ship has an emergency procedure plan called the muster list. And so these 3 things collide during an emergency, and you have to make sure that all those 3 things say the same thing when you have an emergency that involves a helicopter, because if they don't, the insurance is going to take you to the cleaners.
Yeah, I can imagine that the insurance is just one piece of the complexity of all of this. And aviation insurance specifically has been very difficult. So I'm guessing, was it hard to navigate getting insured for these types of operations? International helicopter rides over Antarctica. I mean, I'm just seeing underwriters say, nope.
I think the underwriters, so from what I wasn't part of the insurance discussions, but I did, I was part of the process to make sure we had insurance. We wrote off of the back of the insurance for the aviation provider Starspeed, who had a great, actually one of the things that we put into the RFP, the request for proposal, was that one of our conditions was that the aviation provider should have no accidents whatsoever. And me coming from the Canadian helicopter industry, I was scratching my head at going, how on earth are you ever going to find a helicopter operator who's never had an accident? Like, I didn't know that was possible. And until we found Starspeed, and they're very clean, and they also then have very good insurance. And so the insurers relied on the reputation of the company to make sure that they're hedging their bets as best as they can. So that, I think that's sort of where the insurance discussion was held, is between the operator themselves and the insurance. The vessel, interestingly enough, didn't really care too much about the AV. I mean, they wanted obviously the aircraft provider to be insured, but they didn't. I don't know for sure, but I never saw any communications where they said, how much extra do we need to charge in order to facilitate a helideck operations. I think they look at things like, is the helideck certified? Great. Here's the insurance for that. And so they don't consider the operation. And this is another aspect where I think there might be some oversight, because you should maybe pay a little bit more attention as to, who are the pilots, who's the operator, what kind of type of operation are you engaging in, how often, how frequently, what equipment are you operating, etc. Right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you would think, right? But I mean, that's kind of the funny part about insurance sometimes is they don't actually look at the details, right? They just look at the million-mile view, and then they're checking their boxes, and it's either good or it's not good. Now, you just asked yourself a question. I'm going to ask you, who are the pilots? Who are these guys and gals that are flying this specific mission in Antarctica? What kind of background do they have? What kind of nuances? I guess I went into yesterday's interview thinking that you were a pilot on the vessel, and it wasn't quite the case. They're pilots for this operator. But I'm guessing you've been on the helicopter with them. You've got to operate, in this environment. Who are they? What kind of training do they have? What are the nuances of being a PIC on a boat? Just very fascinated to hear about that.
Join Instrom Helicopter Corporation at this year's VAI Verticon, March 11th through 13th in Dallas, Texas. Instrom will showcase its latest piston and turbine-powered helicopters, highlighting new features like 3-axis VFR autopilot, lightweight lithium-ion batteries, and more. Find Instrom at booth 8211.
This was a question that they posed to me and said, what type of people should we hire? And my gut reaction was, well, hire the people who've done it before, sort of thing. And then you start asking around the industry and go, well, raise your hand if you've flown in Antarctica before, and not very many people can do that. So there really was only two operators that we looked at in terms of the pilots that could do this sort of flying, and one was Canadian, who had have a long history of supporting operations in Antarctica, and they do a lot of work down there. And luckily for Starspeed at the time, they'd had one guy who'd been part of the British Antarctic Survey back in the day, and so he had some Antarctica experience, which was actually very valuable experience. So then we looked at, experience in general, right? So, we looked at flight hours, and we sort of settled on the fact that you probably should have about 3,500 hours, because interestingly, from an accident perspective, people go through cycles in their career where they build all this confidence and nothing happens, and then they have an incident, and then their ego goes down a bit, and then they have a little gut check, and then they gain more experience again, and then their bravery goes up again, and their risk factor goes up. And so there's this cycle in the industry. If you look at accident statistics compared to pilot experience, and 3,500 hours is actually one of those marks where you're suddenly almost a pro at what you're doing, and you feel very confident. So given that none of these guys had an accident, there was significant experience there for us to feel sure that they knew what they were doing. Then we wanted people who are certified on type and had minimum 500 hours on type, which was the H145. It's instrument certified, and even though we don't do any night flying or bad weather flying, we wanted the guys to be full IFR just in case. We had to do emergency evac flight. So sometimes with the type of guests we have, you have heart conditions and other things that come up where you do have to medevac people. And we've done that before in the past as well, to get them back to shore and get them to a hospital where they can receive treatment. One of the other things we looked at, and I think we mentioned this on the last call, is the personality of the person, right? Like we said, you're selling an experience. You have to be social. You have to be engaging. You'd be willing to share a little bit about yourself. People are interested in you, and they'll ask you questions about where you are and who where you've come from, and what you think. Can you tell a good joke? That was one of the things in the job interview. I made sure they could tell a decent joke.
Knock, knock. No.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. You're sort of an all-rounder and experienced type of person that you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing that you say about the 3,500 hours. I've definitely heard about kind of the cycles, but it kind of makes sense. Like if you cycle a couple times, you kind of then can be more consistent because it's kind of like the stock market, right? It's not like if it will crash, but when, right? And so I think flying can often feel the same way. It's like things are going really well. That's when I try to step up my game a little bit. When I'm feeling like safe and comfortable, I try to kind of give myself a bit of a red flag of like, okay, well, this is actually a time where maybe I'm becoming complacent. So that's a kind of a neat point that you brought in there. And 3,500 hours specifically is not something that I've heard. What kind of turnover are you seeing on the pilot side? Are people pretty excited about this job, or has it been higher turnover than you would anticipate just because they're gone from home? I don't know. What's it like to live on the ship? But just all those things.
Yeah. So the turnover, we've had some turnover, but the turnover has not been because the job sucks. People did. I heard they do take a pay cut. I'm not responsible for paying them, but I heard they did take a pay cut compared to flying in. So some of the other jobs these guys will do, they'll fly for like the super wealthy, look at any of the biggest yachts like Zuckerberg and stuff like that. So they'll fly on those yachts and those come with like big paychecks, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this is a tourism operation. There's only so much money in it, so we can afford to pay what we can afford to pay. But the draw is obviously the experience and the uniqueness of the job, and people will always take a pay cut for that sort of thing. So from that perspective, I think, it's a bit of a mixed bag, experience versus pay, but that's been good for people so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm always an advocate to pay more because, I'm a pilot, and so I just think it's better. And I think long-term, even if you pay more up front, long-term, you have better retention. Yeah. Just because at some point, the Antarctica will wear off, right? So you have to be able to retain with compensation. And I think it's kind of a nasty trick of the helicopter industry, really, of this continual carrot, right? Like this, oh, it's in Antarctica, and oh, this. And I'm sure that there's other perks, but I definitely always encourage operators to do a little bit better when it comes to pilot compensation. One of the reasons I don't fly full time anymore is just because of the compensation. I couldn't swallow the fact that I wasn't being compensated for the $100,000+ that I invested to learn, which I just paid off this week, by the way.
Oh, is that right? Congratulations.
Yeah. It only took me 18 years.
Oh my God.
But yeah, paid off my student loan. Actually, it's technically payoff will be on Thursday, but the money's there and it's just waiting to get sent. So that's exciting. But, I just always kind of felt like, man, underpaid. So if that operator's listening, pay your pilots more.
Yeah, I will say that life on board of these boats is very good. I mean, you're living, you usually have, so there's always a gym for the guests, and there's usually a gym for the crew, and food is excellent. So you don't just get rice and beans, you get premium food. I mean, the chefs on these boats are star chefs, right? So the life in general, you can have coffee when you want to, you can have, you're not flying all the time. So you got lots of sea days where you can relax and focus on your own thing. Some guys have a second job on the side. So work-life balance, I feel like, is very good. So that's an important draw, as well as the uniqueness of the flying experience. We actually had to fight very hard to get pilots their own cabins because I wasn't really part of the planning stages in terms of the design of the vessels. So when I got there and I told them that they needed, pilots need their own cabin because that's an aviation regulation, everybody's head started smoking and they're starting scratching and going, okay, where can we find room for these people? And that's one of those things so the yachting industry doesn't typically look at aviation regulations at all. And so they'll build a boat, and they'll go into operation, and a year later they need to get the blowtorch out and start cutting and metal apart because they got to do it right.
It's interesting. Yeah, it makes sense. It's you would think that they would dive in a little bit deeper, especially if they know that there's going to be some helicopter ops. But again, it's it's the something that they're unfamiliar with, and that's why it's nice to have guys like yourself. What about like if you're married? Are you allowed, like, can spouses come on? And like if I'm a pilot and I'm gone for 8 months, is it common to have spouses? The other question is working with the same people and living with the same people. This idea of like fraternization, what has that kind of been like? Because I feel like that could also be difficult, just interpersonal relationships, being around the same people. That could also cause some turmoil. Has that been a thing that you've seen on yachts and this gig yacht specifically?
Yeah, I think that dynamic is very dependent on the yacht and the people involved. So whether or not you have a policy on whether or not people can have a relationship on board, I think, I don't know. It depends on the yacht. I think some relationships work very well on yachts together. And I think when you look at yacht crewing agency and yacht management agencies, they often look for husband and wife couple to manage a yacht because that just works better. But if you're asking me if the 22-year-olds and 25-year-olds should be hanging out with each other, I don't know. That I can see how that could go well and how it couldn't go well, because if you are on a boat for a length of time, some of these boats are out on voyages for 5 weeks or longer. So then, what do you do? And inevitably you can't forbid people from falling in love or doing what they want to do. So, that's an HR problem. It's not a helicopter operations problem.
Well, but I also, not even just from like the relationship of like, boyfriend, girlfriend or whatever, but just like, it's hard to be around. One of the things with air medical is I was very lucky to have great crew. Good flight nurses, paramedics, good people. Just, I enjoyed being around them. I spent a ton of time with them. It wouldn't be uncommon for a hitch that I'm, working with just a 2-cycle crew where I'm seeing the same people every other day for a week. And even in the best circumstances, you get on people's nerves, right?
Yeah.
You do something to piss them off or vice versa. I'm guessing that could be magnitude or a little bit even more on a ship where it's quite confined. Has that been any issue?
We haven't had any issues where people run into each other like that, especially with the big operation that we have. It's actually, the dynamic is very interesting because depending on where the ship sails, so whether it's northern or southern hemispheres, we have different guides on board that are experts in different things. So some people are like geology experts for Antarctica, and others are geology experts for Greenland. So we'll swap out the teams depending on who it is. So while the aviation team routinely cycles through the same 5 or 6 guys, the boat completely changes staff and with the ships as well. So the ship crews tend to do much longer tours. I think they're on for like 6 months at a time. So you'll see them more regularly, but they also cycle out. So there is enough the refresh there for people to not get bored of each other and not get on each other's nerves. The cabin fever is usually avoided. And if it does happen, you just, I think we're all adults. The good thing about the caliber of people is that they're usually highly educated and motivated types of people. So they're much better at conflict resolution themselves than somebody off the street kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it makes sense. From this idea, and I think we might have touched on it part 1, but I don't really remember. So we'll talk about it again. If it's a refresh, then it's a good refresh. But, obviously you're taking people for compensation and hire from the top of the boat. And I think in some cases you're landing on a place where they can go explore. So, you're transporting A to B, here in the United States, obviously sounds very 135-esque. What, I guess, are you guys what governing agency are you complying for when it comes to things like Part 135 operations? Is it, what does this fall under?
So that really doesn't change. The operator will be licensed depending on their civil aviation authority. So whether you're 135 or 703 in Canada or whatever the regular 145 in the UK, that doesn't change just because you're on a yacht. So you still have to adhere to those operational standards. And in fact, for our operation, the UK Civil Aviation Authority, because it was a commercial level operation, they came on the ship once a year to live run flying exercises. So they would fly with the pilots, they'd monitor from the ground, they'd supervise, and then they would sign off and and give us a report and mark a couple of areas of improvement where we needed to improve. And then on top of that, we would also hire an independent auditor to audit the entire operation, like from bottom of the ship all the way up to the top of the rotor blade. It's like looking at fuel and how we do checklists and how we record data and things like that, and whether the systems are working and certified and up to date. And they had, they inevitably always have some findings, which is good because it keeps you on your toes. Everybody gets accustomed to running a ship operation, aviation operation a certain way. People get very comfortable with cutting corners because it's easier. And so that kind of thing keeps you honest and promotes safety, right?
Yeah, it's easy to do so. In the case of a medical emergency that you brought up earlier, I find it fascinating because there's like a lot of 135 operators that here in the United States, like even if there's a medical emergency, it's like very clear in the op specs, like you are to do nothing with that except bring them back to the base and have an air medical helicopter come and do it or whatnot.
Okay.
There was even, a situation when I was at Maverick. I wasn't there for this, but there was a big shooting, that happened in Las Vegas. I think everyone's really familiar with.
The guy from the window,
the festival, and apparently not just at Maverick, but the Papillon and the other tour operators. There's like people coming in, like take us to the hospital, right? And those companies had to be like, well, we can't, right? And it's kind of a weird area, but it's very clear in the op spec. So I guess in this case with the UK, these guys, you are allowed to do secondary missions like medical if needed.
So it's an interesting question because while they don't have an op spec for medevac flights, we are transporting people from A to B, and we're not really providing medical support. We do have a doctor on board though, and most ships will have a ship-owned nurse at the very minimum, but a lot of them will carry a doctor, and that doctor will be certified to administer first aid or triage of some kind. And so with the instances that we had, without getting into specifics, we were just engaged in transporting that person off the ship to the nearest airport, where they can get picked up by an ambulance, air ambulance or street ambulance to transport them to hospital. So it wasn't really a medevac flight officially, right? It was more of a convenience to get the medical attention as quick as possible. And when you're operating in these remote regions, I always look at this. Is the manual often says, if you have a helicopter ditching, call search and rescue. And that's what the manual says. But if you're in Antarctica or even northern Greenland, like, good luck calling anyone.
Yeah. Who do you call?
Yeah. So you have to create your own SOPs on that ship for self-help. And then the question comes up with, like, who goes on, if you have a second helicopter, that's great. Now, who goes on that helicopter? Does the doctor go? What equipment does the doctor take? Do you land and administer first aid, or can you even land? Do you rappel out? So what do you do? And so you have to go through these scenarios, and you have to plan this, and you have to write it down and figure it out and do the training for this. That's the other thing, because training is tricky. Like in tourism, time is money. And to get a company to make time for training, and Cork was really good at this. They made time for training that we could run through these scenarios, and everyone was happy with the amount of time they got to look and study and ask questions about procedures and equipment and things like that. So it's great. That's where it lies. Like, you have to be self-sufficient at some point, whether you have an op spec for medevac or not.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Just, again, this whole thing seems like a logistical nightmare, to be honest, of all the planning. And I feel like you can plan for a million different things, and then a random situation can arise that kind of changes the plan. Under the best circumstances, helicopters are hard to keep running, right? Helicopters are hangar queens. They break a lot. It's part of helicopters. Even at Air Medical, I worked for a very reputable company with great maintenance, but my little air medical base was essentially staffed 24 hours a day with a mechanic, and that mechanic was doing something every single day. What has been the experience like maintenance wise? I can imagine AOG is a big deal, right? If the helicopter's down and you can't take half of the passengers, that's a big financial issue.
Yes.
What has that experience been like? Is there a mechanic on board? Just walk me through that.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Yeah, exactly. So for our 2 aircraft, we usually always had 2 pilots and we had 1 engineer. Depending on the type of flying that we're doing, we had one season where we went to visit this emperor penguin colony that's actually very difficult to get to. And because it's such a draw, so many people wanted to get to it. But the area you fly to, there's always packed like sea ice, and you don't know how close you're actually going to get to the emperor penguin colony. And so you have to do the modeling with flight time, like how if I'm over 35 nautical miles from this colony, I'm going to need to hire a 3rd pilot on the boat. And if I'm under that distance, I can get away with 2 pilots or whatever the distance time combination would be. So from a crewing perspective, two to three pilots for 2 aircraft just for duty time. But 1 engineer is usually enough because the engineer tends to just work on those 2 machines at night then.
Sure.
They do very little assisting during the day. Like they'll get the aircraft ready in the morning and, pre-flight and all that. And then once they're off, they go to bed or at least go get rest. And they're not asked to come back out unless something happens. And so we have had certain issues. Like we had an engine mount go one time and that grounded the aircraft. And so you're on the phone with Airbus, Uruguay going, get me an engine mount ASAP. And we subscribe to power by hour and then service by hour programs for both engine and airframe.
Yeah.
Which guarantees you parts, and like AOG parts get sent the same day kind of thing. But when you're in Antarctica, you're not going to get that part when you need it. And so you have the next 10, 15 days at sea with only 1 aircraft. And so half your passengers are going to go, well, who gets to fly and who doesn't, or how much flying do we get to do? And so you have to share that somehow. And now people are down on their guest experience. And so they want their money back. And then, yes, you're right. It comes with huge financial implications that you really have to consider. So stock your parts properly on board, do good homework on what you need, what you think you're going to need, and then maybe buy like 30% extra. And in terms of overall maintenance and the aircraft going tech, you do see about 30% extra maintenance cost for early maintenance, preventative maintenance that normally wouldn't be done because you kind of just keep going because they have the aircraft's at the base every night. You don't have that luxury. So you got to pre-plan and do some stuff ahead of time. So some calendar items, you got to do them 2 months ahead of time, 3 months ahead of time. That's cost in pocket, right? So
sure. Yeah, it makes sense. But you have to, it's part of that mission and just part of the deal, just of the uniqueness of operating where you're operating. Obviously, when there's money involved, there's always this pressure that can occur. From your perspective, where you're going in as an aviation professional consultant, helping these guys that are very much a for-profit business understand the importance of respecting a PIC decision, whether it's with weather or maintenance. Has that been complicated, or has it been fairly easy to navigate that of, hey, look, if the helicopter's broken, it's broken. And the PIC and the maintenance guy get to make that decision. If it's severe clear, but the winds are 50 knots, the pilot gets to make that decision. Is there ever complexities of navigating that relationship?
Yes, the topic is complex, and I think it'll always boil down to who your boss is and how well you inform them of how an aviation operation should be handled. We were very fortunate at Quark and on Ultramarine that from the very beginning, the company had a very clear understanding that aviation needs its own management, and that's why they brought in someone like me and didn't rely just on external consultants to get it up and running. And so they had the right approach from the very get-go. But you're right. This is the underlying issue that I'm seeing and that I'm happy to help with in the yachting industry, is that they're treating aviation as an accessory to what the yacht can do. And so when they set out to build a yacht, they go, I want a tender, I want a jet ski, I want a submarine, and I want a helicopter. And they loop all those things into the same category. And that's their approach to aviation, is that this thing should be ready whenever I want to go, and let's go. So it's a mindset shift that you have to educate people on. the aviation operator, not at all, but the mariners and the people who operate and run the ship and the captains and the officers, you have to sit down with them and say, look, this is not a jet ski. Like, you can't put gas in it and go. And so you need to have someone in charge that understands how to manage this properly, deal with maintenance schedules, deal with port authorities and permits and downtimes and pilot schedules and all these other things that come into it. So it's just a different beast, and it needs its own management. And the industry currently is not doing it that way.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. I mean, that's very complex, and I think type of personnel or clientele, I should say, sometimes really dictates. In my business, I work with a lot of wealthy individuals, and by and large, great people, but they're also used to kind of getting what they want when they want, right? Because that's the power of money sometimes. In non-aviation aspects, if you want to go to France right now, I can go to France, right? Because if I can afford it, I can afford it. But helicopters and maintenance and weather decisions, that can be very complicated. And so I feel like that's definitely something of a complex nature, when you talk about safety and overall safety of yacht operations. Knowing what let's say that I'm a 1,500-hour pilot. I got some turpentine, been flying it in the ditch, flying tours. And I get an opportunity to go fly for, Jeff Bezos on his yacht or name some rich guy. And what would be your advice to that pilot that's never been in yacht operations? Are they setting themselves up for failure? What do you do in that situation if you're coming in green as a pilot?
It's such an interesting question, because I think both you and I can relate to this really, really well, because we were once at that point, and there's nothing we couldn't do. Right? Like, our opinion was like, let me at it. Like, I can figure this out. I can do it better than the last guy. Like,
well, you were the best example of that. I mean, that was part one, right? You get 1.8 hours of long line experience, and boom, you're working seismic and propane.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because what do you tell people? But my advice at the moment would be like, go do some offshore flying and learn about a structure. Because bush flying is one thing. It's like you're on your own. It's a little cowboy, right? You can get away with some stuff that you can't get away with under IFR conditions, flying to oil and gas rigs, to like twin pilot operations. So I think that offshore, whenever you're flying over the water long distances and you have the potential to get into a bad situation with weather, I think you definitely need to be IFR rated, first of all. So whether you have 1,500 hours or not, you need to have some real world IFR time. The customer that you end up having will demand that anyway. So they may have someone who will tell them that a 1,500-hour guy isn't sufficient. But I've seen yachts where the pilot is relatively inexperienced, and there'll be a 206 on there or an A-star, and the often what happens is the yacht owner will own the aircraft already, and they'll go to they'll have a private jet, so they'll go to the private jet captain and go, hey Bob, can you fly helicopters? And Bob will be like, no, but I know a guy who can, or my son or my cousin or whoever. And then all of a sudden, that's the guy, right? So experience is not necessarily a thing. It's more of a trust issue. So privacy is big with these people. Like, who can they trust, or to keep things hush hush, and who will do what they want you to do, right? In the absence of permits and all this other stuff. And so there's a little bit of that to it as well, other than the experience factor. So a lot of it is, whether or not you get a job on one of these yachts is right place, right time. And it's not necessarily that your experience will get you that job.
And I would add to it too, like, look, I have no yacht experience, so I can't speak to that side, but I've definitely been in situations before, specifically working for individuals on a private level or a corporate level, where there might be an expectation to kind of operate in the gray area. And that's not a great place for a pilot to be in. It's unsafe, right?
Yeah.
So I always look at it from an accounting standpoint, like, how much is my life worth? If I'm getting paid by this billionaire $100,000 to fly on a yacht, I'm thinking my life is worth more than 100 personally. I don't know if I could actually put a number on it anymore. I'm about to have a kid. All these factors change.
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of people fall into an area where you don't value yourself at a high enough level. So there's you could kill yourself, and B, there's a good chance you could also violate yourself with whatever agency, in our case, the FAA, right, where you'll get zero support from that owner operator because the earnest of the flight operation falls on you. So if you're a young individual, you're excited, you maybe have a good opportunity to either fly a corporate gig or even a yacht gig, hold your ground. Make sure that you're being a strong PIC. Living in the gray area is not a good place to be. That person, that individual that's paying you may do a lot of really nice things for you. You might have some extra perks of the job. Maybe you can go stay at their house in, Hawaii every once in a while or whatever it may be. Yeah. Right. But if you're allowed to live in this weird area, it's going to bite you, either regulatory or your life. So just be careful, right? I think that's it's a weird spot to be. I've talked about this on the podcast before, but like the best advice I've ever gotten was to be able to say no. And I think the more money people have, the harder it is sometimes to say no, because you lose your job.
You lose your job, exactly. That's it. You're done. Yeah.
It's a weird situation. So, well, look, part two. I'm glad that we did this. I got to learn so much more about just the regulatoriness of it. I'm just fascinated. I think it's such a neat operation. I think it's just another awesome thing that helicopters have the ability to do is they can legitimately land on a boat, not even a big boat, can land on a boat. And that's just a neat part of helicopters. And obviously for yachting, that could be for private individuals. It could be for tourism in your case. I'm sure that there's research vessels that are also using helicopters. There's tuna boats that are using helicopters. That's a different story. I wouldn't even get into that operation. But, just very fascinating. Just as a reminder, what are the consulting agencies that you're with or that you have?
I have two consulting companies, one focusing on big commercial projects, over 200 passenger kind of vessels. And it's called Deck 8 Aviation. That's just deck and the number 8 aviation.com. And the other one that's more bespoke to private yacht operations is called HelicoptersOnYachts.com.
HelicoptersOnYachts.com. And then Deck 8, the number 8 aviation.com. If you're listening to the podcast, maybe you're a pilot that's part of an operation that you're currently working for a rich guy or gal. They're adding a yacht. They want to have helicopters on the yacht, and they're looking at you to make it happen. This is probably something that you shouldn't do alone. And so use this resource. Go check out, get in touch with Felix and see how that consulting service can benefit the operation. Obviously, I'm guessing there's a pretty good cost to that type of service, but I think there's so much that can go wrong on a yacht. You see the videos of the things flying up in the rotor systems from the yacht because of untrained crew, just all the logistics that go on. So it's money well spent, and owners and operators should be educated on, hey, this isn't normal operation, right? The yacht is completely foreign, completely different operation. So make sure that you, again, are standing up for safety and getting people like Felix on board. Felix, thank you so much for coming on. Fascinating story, fascinating journey. It's cool to also hear that you're giving back by now, kind of going back to the flight school environment and helping there. This is such a cool conversation. You had mentioned you had contributed to Vertical. What are some of the articles that you've written for Vertical, and I can help our readers actually go and find that?
Yeah, I think it's the European Rotors issue. I'm not sure the fall issue 2024. There's an article in there about the Antarctica operations that we did. So it's a little bit of a summary of what I think we talked about on the two phone calls. But that's in there. That's the only one so far. Maybe I'm looking forward to more.
And you wrote the article?
Yeah, I helped write it. It's a back and forth usually with the editor. So
nice. Who did you work? Yeah. Did you work with Oliver in that case?
That's right. Ollie, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, Oliver's great. I've been trying to get Oliver on the podcast. He's like, how don't they get anyone who wants to? I'm like, dude, you're the editor of Vertical magazine, the largest helicopter magazine. I think people would want to talk. So Oliver, I challenge you to come on the podcast. Well, very cool. If you want to check out Felix's story, just go to vertical.com and you can actually just search Felix Christians and the article should pop up. So that's one way to find it. Felix, thank you again for not just 1 hour of time, but 2 hours of time. And again, it's deck8aviation.com. What was the other one?
HelicoptersOnYachts.com.
HelicoptersOnYachts.com. And then, of course, Select Aviation College is the college that he's working with out of Canada. They have great opportunities for foreign students as well. And so I know that Felix is specifically kind of looking over the German, Austria, kind of Europe crowd. So if you're interested in learning about that, also reach out. Is it Gingerbread Pilot on Insta?
Gingerbeard Pilot, although it's not so ginger anymore.
Gingerbeard. It looks a little gray to me. I got to be honest.
Yeah, it's a lot of gray in it now. It's all white.
I'm bald, obviously, as you can tell. I've noticed recently if I grow my beard out, it's very gray, which is very sad. And I don't even have a kid yet. That's on the way here soon. And I'm only 36, which I think is, I guess, old, but it seems too young still for like a lot of gray. I'm a little disappointed.
Yeah, it'll come. As soon as you have that kid, you're getting a lot grayer than that. So
I know, a little girl too. I'm sure she's going to put me through the ringer. To our listeners, thank you so much for supporting the Helicopter Podcast. And of course, big thanks to all of our sponsors and MHM Publishing for creating the Vertical HeliCAST platform. If you haven't checked out the platform, I highly encourage that you do. Word on the street is that we're actually adding a new podcast soon that's going to be specific to like med crews working in the back of the helicopters. So I'm really excited to hear about that. You can check out the Vertical MRO podcast with Val, Real Rescue with my boy Jason Quinn, rescue swimmer number 500, doing some awesome things at the Real Rescue. And of course, John Gray and Jack Shanley on the Hangar Z on the law enforcement side. So check it out. Like, subscribe, follow, do what you're supposed to do. And also come give me a follow at Heli Halsey. Thanks, Felix.
Thanks, man. Have a good one.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors. Join Instrom Helicopter Corporation at this year's VAI Verticon, March 11th through 13th in Dallas, Texas. Instrom will showcase its latest piston and turbine-powered helicopters, highlighting new features like 3-axis VFR autopilot, lightweight lithium-ion batteries, and more. Find Instrom at booth 8211.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.